You know that feeling when you see someone and instantly recognize them, not just by their face, but by their energy? David Bowie had that. He was a shapeshifter, a magician of reinvention, a rock star who refused to be tied down by any single image. One day he was a space-traveling alien, the next, a stylish gentleman with slicked-back hair crooning smooth jazz, and then, suddenly, he was an eccentric storyteller with a twinkle in his eye, whispering secrets of the universe through his lyrics. Bowie wasn't just a musician, he was a walking piece of art. His voice, instantly recognizable, his style, impossible to define, his influence, everywhere. But how did this quiet, artistic boy from the London suburbs become the man who would change music forever? That's what we're here to explore. From a childhood brawl that left him with his hypnotic gaze, to the moment he turned down a royal honor, his life was filled with unexpected twists, some of them strange, some of them brilliant, but all of them undeniably Bowie. And so let's begin with something as simple as a name. Because believe it or not, David Bowie wasn't always David Bowie. Imagine a world where David Bowie never existed. Not the man himself, but the name. Because, once upon a time, he wasn't Bowie at all. He was David Jones, a perfectly normal, everyday name. And that was exactly the problem. See, back in the early days, David was just another young musician trying to make it big. He had the talent, the ambition, the sharp cheekbones, but so did a lot of other guys. And unfortunately, there was already another musician named Davy Jones. Not just any Davy Jones either, the one from the Monkees. A band so wildly popular at the time that if David had stuck with his birth name, he might have been lost in the noise. So he had to change it. But to what? There were a few attempts. At one point, he briefly considered Tom Jones, but, well, another famous singer had already claimed that too. And then inspiration struck. He borrowed the name Bowie from a legendary American frontiersman, Jim Bowie, the guy famous for the massive knife. Why? Because, as David once put it cuts both ways. And just like that, David Bowie was born. It wasn't just a stage name. It was a declaration, the first transformation of many, a sign that he was never going to be just another musician in the crowd. And speaking of transformations, let's talk about that stare, the piercing gaze that became one of his most famous features. Because as striking as it wasn't a trick of genetics. It was the result of something much more unexpected. If you've ever seen a close-up of David Bowie, you've probably noticed something unusual. His eyes. They seemed different, almost hypnotic, one darker than the other, like he was constantly staring into two worlds at once. A lot of people thought he had different colored eyes, a condition called heterochromia. It made sense. Bowie was otherworldly in so many ways. Why not this too? But the truth was even stranger. His eye color was actually the same. What made them look so different was a childhood fight that left him with a permanently dilated pupil. It happened when he was just a teenager, over something that, in hindsight, seems ridiculously small. A girl. His best friend, George Underwood, punched him square in the eye during an argument about who she liked more, and it wasn't just any punch. It was a hit so hard that it damaged the muscles responsible for contracting his pupil. At first, Bowie thought it would heal, but it never did. The injury left his right eye frozen wide open, unable to adjust to light like the other one. The result? That famous, almost alien-like gaze that made him look like he was always deep in thought, or maybe even seeing things the rest of us couldn't. Here's the best part. Bowie never held a grudge. In fact, he and George remained close friends for life. And in a strange twist of fate, that punch may have actually helped his career, because when he finally stepped onto the music scene, those eyes became part of his mystique. People couldn't look away. And speaking of looking beyond, Bowie had an obsession that stretched far beyond our little planet, something that would inspire one of his first big hits, a song that wasn't just a breakthrough for him, but would become eerily tied to a real-life event happening at the same time. In the late 1960s, the world was obsessed with space. It was the era of moon missions, of astronauts becoming global heroes, of humankind reaching beyond Earth for the very first time. And right in the middle of it all, a young David Bowie was dreaming about the stars in his own way. He was fascinated by the idea of isolation, the loneliness of floating through the cosmos, disconnected from everything you once knew. And from that thought came Space Oddity, a haunting song about an astronaut named Major Tom, lost in the endless dark. It was unlike anything else at the time, mysterious, melancholic, cinematic. Bowie wasn't just writing a song, he was telling a story. But here's where things get a little eerie. Just days after Space Oddity was released, something huge happened. Something that would make Bowie's song feel almost like a premonition. NASA successfully landed Apollo 11 on the moon, and millions of people sat glued to their televisions watching in awe as Neil Armstrong took that first step into the unknown. British television networks, scrambling for the perfect soundtrack to this historic moment, started playing Space Oddity in their coverage. Suddenly, Bowie's voice was everywhere. Of course, the song's ending wasn't exactly uplifting. Major Tom gets lost in space, disconnected forever. Probably not the best message to send while astronauts were actually out there. But by the time anyone realized that, the connection between Bowie and space was already sealed. From that moment on, he wasn't just a musician. He was something more. An artist with one foot on Earth and the other somewhere far beyond. And this was only the beginning, because Bowie wouldn't just sing about space, he would become space. His next transformation would take the world by storm, with fire-red hair, skin-tight jumpsuits, and a story straight out of science fiction. If you could travel back in time to the early 1970s and step into a David Bowie concert, you wouldn't just see a man playing music. You'd witness a full-blown spectacle. Something between a rock show and an alien invasion. And at the center of it all was Ziggy Stardust. Bowie didn't just create a stage persona, he built an entire mythology around it. Ziggy was an androgynous rock star from another planet, sent to Earth as a messenger of hope only to be consumed by the very fame he created. His look, blazing red hair, lightning bolt makeup, futuristic jumpsuits that looked like they were stolen from a cosmic fashion show. It was mesmerizing, theatrical, dangerous, and it worked. Audiences weren't just watching Bowie perform, they were watching him become Ziggy. Fans screamed like they were at a Beatles concert. People truly believed Bowie might not be human. Even musicians who thought they'd seen it all were blown away. Elton John once described seeing Bowie as Ziggy and thinking, this guy is from another planet. But here's the thing, Bowie got so deep into the role that it started to take over his life. The lines between himself and his creation blurred. He lived as Ziggy, dressed as Ziggy, spoke as Ziggy. And the more the character spiraled toward destruction in his music, the more Bowie felt like he was being pulled down with him. By 1973, he'd had enough. At the peak of Ziggy's fame, in the middle of a sold-out show, Bowie made a shocking announcement. This is the last show that we'll ever do. The crowd went silent. The band looked confused. Was he quitting music? Was he serious? What they didn't realize was that Bowie wasn't saying goodbye to music. He was saying goodbye to Ziggy. He had killed his own creation right there on stage. And then, just like that, he disappeared. But Bowie was never one to stay gone for long. He had already set his sights on something new, something darker, sleeker, and far more dangerous than Ziggy had ever been. By the mid-1970s, David Bowie had left Ziggy Stardust behind. But he hadn't left transformation. He was always evolving, always one step ahead of everyone else. But this time, his reinvention wasn't just theatrical. It was unsettling. Enter the thin white duke. Gone were the cosmic jumpsuits and wild hair. Instead, Bowie emerged as a ghostly, hollow-eyed figure in a crisp black suit, slicked back blonde hair, and an unsettling detachment. He looked like a faded Hollywood aristocrat, cold, elegant, untouchable. And the character wasn't just an aesthetic shift. The Thin White Duke was Bowie at his most extreme. By this point, he was living in Los Angeles, surrounded by excess and isolation. He barely ate, surviving mostly on milk, red peppers, and an alarming amount of cocaine. He was dangerously thin, barely sleeping, and becoming obsessed with the occult, secret societies, and conspiracy theories. At one point, he even believed his swimming pool was haunted. His music reflected this eerie transformation. Station to Station, the album that introduced the Duke, wasn't just a sonic departure, it was a warning signal. The title track opens with a mechanical chugging sound, like a train dragging itself through the night. Then, Bowie's voice appears, colder than ever. The return of the Thin White Duke, throwing darts in lovers' eyes. Unlike Ziggy, there was no warmth in this character, no hope. Just a hollow shell walking through a world that barely felt real. And what made it even more disturbing? Bowie wasn't sure where the character ended and where he began. Later, he admitted that he barely remembered making Station to Station. The drug-fueled haze had consumed him, and the Duke, with his detached, almost sinister presence, had taken control. But Bowie wasn't meant to burn out. He was meant to survive, and he knew that if he didn't escape Los Angeles, he might not make it. So he did something drastic. He packed his bags and disappeared to Berlin. There, in the cold gray streets of West Germany, everything changed. The drugs, the paranoia, the dangerous spiral, it all stopped, and in their place he found something new, a sound that would define an era. Los Angeles had nearly swallowed him whole. The cocaine, the paranoia, the Thin White Duke, it was all spiraling out of control. David Bowie knew he had to escape, so he did something completely unexpected. He moved to Berlin. This wasn't the glamorous, neon-soaked Berlin people imagine today. In the late 1970s, the city was divided by the Cold War, split between East and West by a brutal concrete wall. On one side, Soviet-controlled oppression. On the other, a counterculture scene unlike anything in the world, gritty, rebellious, and alive. And Bowie, he thrived in it. He stripped everything back. No more Hollywood mansions, no more extravagant parties. He lived in a modest apartment with Iggy Pop, rode a bicycle around the city like a regular person, and finally, after years of excess, started taking care of himself. Berlin became his creative rebirth. He wandered the streets, fascinated by the tension between the two halves of the city. He found inspiration in the experimental electronic music coming out of Germany at the time. Groups like Kraftwerk and Nö were pioneering a cold, robotic sound that felt like the future. Bowie wanted in. And so, with producer Brian Eno, he created something revolutionary, the Berlin Trilogy. The first album, Low, was like nothing he'd ever done before. It was cold, fragmented, full of eerie instrumentals and strange robotic rhythms. Critics were confused, but fans, they felt it. Bowie was speaking a new language, one built from the ghosts of Berlin, the echoes of the war, the feeling of a city split in two. Then came Heroes, and with it, one of his most iconic songs, the title track, Heroes, was inspired by a real-life couple Bowie had seen kissing near the Berlin Wall. They were lovers, separated by politics, finding stolen moments in the shadow of barbed wire and guard towers. The song captured all the pain and hope of a city divided. Even today, when people hear heroes, they don't just hear a song, they hear defiance. The Berlin years saved Bowie. They stripped him down to his rawest, most experimental self. And when he finally left the city, he wasn't the thin white duke anymore. He was something new. He was ready to conquer the world again. Berlin had given him his soul back. The drug-fueled chaos was behind him, and he had reinvented himself as an artist on the cutting edge. But now, David Bowie was about to do something truly shocking. He was going to become a pop star. Not the avant-garde alien rock star type of pop star. No. This time, Bowie was going mainstream. In the early 1980s, he teamed up with Nile Rodgers, the mastermind behind the disco-funk band Chic, and together they crafted something completely unexpected, Let's Dance. The title track was unlike anything Bowie had done before. Funky, bright, infectious. It was a dance anthem built for stadiums, radio waves, and MTV. It had blistering guitar solos from Stevie Ray Vaughan and a groove that made it impossible not to move. And when the music video dropped, it was clear Bowie wasn't just making hits, he was making statements. The video for Let's Dance wasn't just a glossy pop production, it was a critique of colonialism and racial inequality. Filmed in Australia, it followed two Indigenous Australians navigating a world built to oppress them. Bowie wasn't just here to sell records. He was using his voice to say something. And it worked. Let's Dance became the biggest hit of his career. It shot to #1 in the US, the UK, and a dozen other countries. Suddenly, Bowie wasn't just an art rock legend. He was a global pop icon. The success of the album catapulted him into a level of fame he had never quite experienced before. Massive stadium tours, non-stop media attention, money pouring in from every direction. But here's the thing about Bowie. He never stayed in one place for long. At first, he embraced the pop star life. The Serious Moonlight Tour was a worldwide spectacle, with Bowie at his most polished and charismatic. But soon, the pressure of being a mainstream icon started to wear on him. He was used to creating art, not just hits. And deep down, he knew something was missing. So, as the 1980s rolled on, Bowie did what he always did best. He disappeared into the shadows again, this time to figure out what came next. The Let's Dance era had turned Bowie into something he never fully wanted to be, a megastar, the kind of celebrity who filled stadiums and had his face plastered everywhere. And at first it was thrilling, the success, the crowds, the global dominance. But then it started to feel hollow. Bowie later admitted that the mid-1980s were one of the most creatively unfulfilling times of his life. He was trapped in a cycle of expectations. Record labels wanted more hits, more stadium tours, more of the Let's Dance magic. But Bowie wasn't a human jukebox, he was an artist. And he was starting to feel like he had lost control of his own career. So what did he do? He vanished. For a while, Bowie drifted, releasing albums like Tonight and Never Let Me Down. But even he knew they didn't have the magic of his earlier work. He called them career fillers, music made for the sake of keeping up appearances. And when he went on tour in 1987 with the massive Glass Spider tour, it was clear Bowie was done playing the role of a stadium-filling pop icon. So he walked away. For the first time in decades, he stopped being David Bowie. He formed a band, not a solo project, not another reinvention of his persona, a real, no-frills, straight-up rock band called Tin Machine. It was raw, aggressive, and stripped of any superstar pretensions, and it confused everyone. Fans were baffled, critics were divided, but for Bowie, it was a creative reset. He wasn't standing center stage as an icon. He was just another musician in a band, sweating it out in tiny clubs, playing loud, messy rock music. And it worked. Tin Machine didn't last forever, but it cleansed him. It burned away all the excess of the ADS and gave him something he desperately needed: freedom. And when he returned as a solo artist in the 1990s, he wasn't just back, he was reborn. The 1990s were a time of turbulent change. The internet was just beginning to reshape the way we lived, worked, and connected with the world, and pop culture was being hit with a wave of new sounds, new technologies, and new ideas. And in the middle of all this, David Bowie didn't just adapt to the times, he embraced them, sometimes in ways that no one expected. First, let's talk about the internet. In 1996, David Bowie did something that made waves before social media was even a thing. He launched his own website before it was cool or even widely understood. And it wasn't just a place for fans to get information. He used it as a platform for a new kind of interaction. Fans could join chat rooms, talk directly to Bowie, and explore digital art and music in ways they never had before. He had always been ahead of the curve, and now he was using the internet to create an intimate, digital space with his audience. And that wasn't all. As the 90s continued, Bowie started collaborating with younger artists and musicians who were experimenting with new genres. One of the most exciting collaborations was with the genre-defying electronic music scene. He was particularly drawn to drum and bass, a genre known for its breakbeats, dark bass lines, and futuristic vibes. Bowie was always ahead of his time, and when he teamed up with the British electronic duo The Chemical Brothers and other cutting-edge producers, his sound evolved again. This time, it was an exploration of techno, ambient, and electronic music. Earthling, released in 1997, was the product of this experimentation. It was fast, loud, and fully immersive. The album's opening track, Little Wonder, is a perfect example, chaotic, glitchy, with hypnotic beats and layers of samples. It felt like the soundtrack to a futuristic world. In many ways, Earthling felt like a prescient glance into the future, where the lines between music, technology, and culture were blurring. Bowie had always been someone who wasn't just chasing the future, he was shaping it. The 90s proved this to the world in ways that were both innovative and deeply connected to his earlier desire to push boundaries. He wasn't just a figurehead from the past, he was still relevant, still daring to venture into the unknown. But it wasn't just music and technology that he was reinventing. Bowie was also dabbling in acting again, appearing in films like The Man Who Fell to Earth and Labyrinth that kept his cinematic legacy alive. He was stepping back into his role as a cultural chameleon, and the world was still watching. As the new millennium rolled in, David Bowie had already lived several lives. He had been a glam rock pioneer, a pop icon, a cutting-edge experimenter, a digital trailblazer, and a cultural provocateur. But in the final years of his life, Bowie seemed to reach a new level of artistic transcendence. He was in his mid-60s when he returned to the studio in the early 2010s, a time when many musicians slowed down or retire. But not Bowie. He was just getting started again. In 2013, at the age of 66, he released The Next Day, his first album in a decade. There was no big build-up, no flashy marketing campaigns. It dropped quietly, with no warning, almost as though Bowie had been waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. The album was filled with raw, reflective songs that hinted at a life lived fully, and the lyrics were darker, introspective, and even sorrowful in places. He wasn't trying to recapture the past, he was acknowledging it. And with tracks like Where Are We Now?, Bowie confronted his own legacy, reflecting on his years in Berlin and his life in music. And then just 2 years later, something even more unexpected happened. Bowie released Blackstar, an album that sounded like a culmination of everything he had ever done. It was ambitious, experimental, and in many ways utterly new. The album, filled with jazz influences, haunting melodies, and layered complexities, was not just a reflection of where he was musically. It was also a stark self-awareness of his impending mortality. By the time Blackstar hit the shelves on January 8, 2016, David Bowie had already been diagnosed with cancer. He knew his time was limited, and yet he poured every last ounce of creativity into the album. It's as if he knew this was his final statement to the world, his farewell. The final track, I Can't Give Everything Away, was bittersweet in its title alone. He was leaving us with pieces of himself, but there was always something he couldn't give away, something only he could understand. And then, just 2 days after its release, on January 10th, 2016, David Bowie passed away. It was a shocking, gut-wrenching loss. The world had just begun to process Blackstar, and suddenly the artist who had been a constant presence in the cultural landscape for nearly 5 decades was gone. But Bowie's legacy wasn't just in his music. It was in the way he had lived, fearlessly, relentlessly, always changing, always evolving. He had inspired generations to think outside the box, to embrace individuality, and to push boundaries. And though he was gone, his influence continues to ripple through the worlds of music, fashion, art, and pop culture. His life was a reminder that we don't have to be bound by expectations. We can be anyone, do anything, and change as many times as we want, just like David Bowie did. This concludes our journey through the life of David Bowie. His music may have ended, but his impact, it's everlasting. Thank you for joining me in this celebration of a legend, one who redefined what it meant to be an artist. David Bowie's story isn't just one of fame or success. It's a reminder that the only true constant is change, and in that change, there's infinite possibility.